We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the Doones to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
So probably most of you have met Byrne already. Byrne Power being a long-time friend of L'Abri. You were here first.
78.
78. Wow. So a long time. He's been coming back and forth, and he now lives and has lived for some years. How many years has he been in Alaska?
19 years in Alaska.
19 years in Alaska. And in the time that we've been here, you've probably been here 4 times, 5 times maybe.
Yeah.
And he's always having to give us really interesting lectures on all kinds of interesting, different things that you may not have thought about before. And so he'll be here for 3 weeks now, and he's going to be giving us a lecture a week. And I forget the exact title of today's lecture.
This is called Horizontal Propaganda and Social Media. User-friendly title.
Okay, yeah. And something that most people in the room have probably had some encounter.
Well, the second 2 words, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Okay. Again, the title of this is Horizontal Propaganda and Social Media. And I'm going to spend a good half of the lecture just explaining what I mean by propaganda, because I think it's a word that gets really fuzzy when it's used. But before I do, I would like to recommend one book, and I've read quite a few books related to propaganda and stuff, but the one that really opened my eyes on the subject was by Jacques Ellul. That's Jacques, and then Ellul. And the name of the book is Propaganda. You could just find it by looking at that word. And then there's a subtitle, The Formation of Men's Attitudes. And it was originally written in French in 1962 and translated into English in 1965. And it has been in print ever since. Jacques Ellul was a Protestant French Christian who wrote quite a few very interesting books, and his books kind of divide between sociological categories, of which this would be, and theological categories. I first ran across this book in about 1983. A friend of mine had recommended it, and I read it, and at that point I said, it was like someone opened my eyes. And I said, I became a Christian in 1970. I was about 15. I wish I had discovered this when I was around 20. I wish I had discovered it about 6-7 years earlier than I did, because it explains so much of why things were the way they were, in the sense that it was almost like, it's like someone stripped my eyes and said, here's the fictitious panorama that we live in, and now, what do you think of this? And I was like, uh-oh. But ever since then, I have noticed this book has remained true. That is to say that what I saw in this book wasn't just like a flash in the night kind of like, wow, what a great book kind of experience, but rather the subject matter has remained true, and it's much more affects us today than it did then. So I highly recommend looking for the book, Propaganda. So let me just start off by saying I may step on some toes during this lecture, especially dealing with this subject. And in a way, that is my objective. I want to get you thinking, and I want to get you raising questions. And the subject of propaganda is the kind of thing that we get involved with various modes of thinking. We don't even know where these ideas come from. They just kind of come to us through osmosis, or through people, or in this case, through social media. But I hope that my prodding and poking is not without compassion, though, and that's a very important thing. Also, it's not my intention to discuss any of the propagandas that I mention. And so if I create a sense of unease in discussing some particular thought that you hold or outlook that you hold near and dear, you can find me later, talk about it at a formal meal, but that's not the point of this. The point of this is not to discuss whether this idea or that idea is correct. The point of this is to essentially create tension by discussing all of them, and to essentially help us find ways to talk to each other again that are human. And I have seen a vast change in this in my lifetime. I first became a Christian at the age of 15, and it was part of what was then called the Jesus movement, Jesus people. We never used the word Jesus freaks, by the way. That was what we were called. We didn't like that. We were not freaks for Jesus. We were people. But I remember, for instance, being able to pass out a pamphlet that we might have written. These were not great works of art or communication, and actually engaging in conversations on the streets when I was like 17, 18, 19, 20. Sometime around the year 1975, 76, just to put a relative date on it, things started changing. I started noticing people would just take them and drop them. They would not engage anymore. Since then, I've noticed other periods in which, for instance, all the way into the 1980s, mid-80s, I could, if I disagreed with someone on a subject, like let's say someone was radical lesbian feminist and I am a Christian, we would have endless discussions. We would say, well, why are you right? And why are you right? And how do you know you're right? And such. By the 1990s, though, it didn't happen anymore. Not in the same way, not in the kind of free-for-all spirit. What happened by that time was people were kind of, oh, that's what you believe, kind of thing, which was a way of kind of ending the discussion. By the recent times, however, well, we'll discuss that. There is a demarcation point at which I'm going to discuss, and that demarcation point, for better or worse, starts sometime after MySpace, around the beginning of Facebook. So we're going to get into that. And again, it is my intention to help us find a way to have serious discussions again, and discussions that involve our substantial differences amongst each other and amongst people we have radical disagreements with. Let us begin. First, let's discuss propaganda. And in order to discuss propaganda, I have to discuss what I don't mean by propaganda. Let me put it this way. Propaganda isn't the lies they tell versus the truth we speak. That's really important, because I think when a lot of people use the word, it's just like they're using propaganda. It's whoever they are. They're using propaganda. Another thing is, be warned, even when people strongly denounce propaganda, they tend to be speaking primarily about the propaganda of their enemies. They rarely conceive of the idea that they are in the process of making propaganda as they do it. So, obviously, in doing this, I am being very, very clear not to make propaganda, which is why I will be hitting targets all across the political map, because I haven't got a dog in this fight, except I just want to have human discussions. I'm not trying to promote even my Christianity through doing this. I'm trying to promote discussion and to give you the idea that when you meet people who have radically different ideas, don't just go turn them off, but find a way to engage as a human being. A good example of this idea of really pointing at propaganda and making it is Noam Chomsky has many speeches against the propaganda of corporate America. And I've never once, and I've listened to quite a few of those lectures, never once heard him mention that he was making propaganda for his own left-leaning, anti-corporatist camp. In other words, his ideas are exactly the kind of ideas behind Occupy Wall Street. But the point is, Occupy Wall Street, for instance, like the Tea Party, are both propaganda blocks, first and foremost. We may call them movements, but in fact, interestingly enough, I don't think Occupy Wall Street lasted very long because it didn't have enough support. It didn't have a big enough propaganda base to start from. But that's another subject. Many people who do have some idea about the nature of propaganda tend to equate it with a very small subset of propaganda that we'll call war propaganda. Some of you may remember what life was like in the U.S. In the couple of years after September 11th. There was a lot of war propaganda being done then. It was very hard. I mean, the left-wing people were like really stuck up against a wall and couldn't really fight it, because war propaganda tends to take an actual event and then pow, land on it. And it's really hard to deny. But war propaganda is also the kind of propaganda that we traditionally equate with people like the Nazis, the Soviets. Many people kind of see propaganda as something that they use, these extreme kinds of political or social groupings. If people are a bit cleverer, they do recognize that America, France, Great Britain have all made war propaganda as well. But by identifying propaganda by this most obvious species, we have essentially let most of the propaganda slip through. So that by defining it in this narrow sort of way as the big obvious, go join up and fight kind of propaganda, we let a lot of the more insidious stuff get in. Another misconception is that intelligence is some sort of bulwark against propaganda. Jacques Ellul really hammers this one home in his book, Propaganda. In a sense, in this view, the best way to fight off the effects of propaganda is to keep up with the issues and stay informed. The very opposite is the truth. The more intelligent person who tends to be the most propagandized person, which may sound counterintuitive, but if you think about it, they're taking in much more information. Whereas on the other end of the social scale, the lower classes, who tend to be the least informed, tend to be the least propagandized. If you find someone who hasn't got a job and is just kind of living on the street and you talk to them, you can guarantee the things you hear coming from them are not going to be your normal everyday thoughts. Why? Because they're not living in the normal everyday world. Whereas the people who have the most exposure to all the information running through are the people who are the most propagandized. And I would include myself in that. That is to say, I obviously keep an eye on things, so I have to be very careful about the information and where it's coming from and what it means. Also, though, propaganda is not simply any effort to change opinions and attitudes. There is a difference between real dialogue and propaganda. That is to say, if Vincent and I are threatening to have a discussion about video games, if we have a discussion, we'll have some areas of disagreement, it sounds like. Great. Now, here's where the problem comes in. If what a person says comes not from themselves, but from a whole phalanx of informational systems behind you, and the other person is doing this, then what's happening is you have essentially two competing propagandas going at each other. And one of the things Jacques Ellul says is when you get two competing propagandas going at each other, you don't get the truth. You get slugged in the middle, and you walk away woozy going like, well, I don't know what to believe. Propaganda, though, is not just arguments and conversation. If a person has their own ideas, even if they relate to, say, I'm a Christian. If someone talks with me, I would hope I am not parroting just Christian cliches, Christian isms, that I'm saying something of substance. So then, what do we mean by propaganda? Let me give you some dictionary definitions, and then I'm going to get to Jacques Ellul's definition. First, the Oxford Dictionary says, it's information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a political cause or point of view. Or it could be the dissemination of propaganda as a political strategy, as in the sentence, the party's leaders believed that a long period of education and propaganda would be necessary. And in that sentence, you hear it's not particularly good or bad. We need to educate people kind of thing. But propagandists will also often talk about education. The real root of the word comes from the following. It's a committee of cardinals in the Roman Catholic Church responsible for foreign missions. And this particular committee was founded in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV. It was Italian from modern Latin Congregatio de Propaganda Fide. In other words, congregation for the propagation of the faith. So the words propaganda and propagation used to be pretty much synonymous. They have since broken apart, and at a certain point here you'll see a bit of the difference between propagation versus propaganda. But I don't like the Oxford definition. I could see that coming a mile away. biased, misleading, political, blah, 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 blah. And all of us would feel like, no, I'm not going to fall for that. Ellul's definition is much different than that, and I think much more correct. The Merriam-Webster definition, here's their simple definition. Ideas are statements that are often false and exaggerated that are spread in order to help a cause, a political leader, a government. And the full definition of propaganda: 1, when it's capitalized, it is the congregation of the Roman Curia having jurisdiction over missionary territories and related institutions. 2, they're coming to get me. 2, the spreading of ideas and information or rumor for the purpose of helping or injuring an institution, a cause, or a purpose. And 3, ideas, facts, or allegations spread deliberately to further one's cause or to damage an opposing cause. Also a public action having such an effect. And again, you get this whole very much like, misleading information, rumors, and such. Certainly, there is an aspect of propaganda that relates to this, but that's much too shallow a definition. And again, dealing with what I'm going to deal with here, it isn't that you're sitting there, people are sitting there lying to you. And again, it goes back to the beginning. It's not the truth we have versus the lies they tell. So, here's Wikipedia. Take that for what it's worth. Propaganda is a form of communication, often biased and misleading in nature, aimed at influencing and altering the attitude of the population towards some cause, position, or political agenda in an effort to form a consensus to a standard set of belief patterns. A little better, although I do notice says citation needed. Then, it continues. Propaganda is information that is not impartial and is used primarily to influence an audience and further an agenda, often by presenting facts selectively, perhaps lying by omission, to encourage a particular synthesis, or using loaded messages to produce an emotional or rather than a rational response to the information presented. Citation needed. Finally, while the term, see, these 3 different views are all right here. While the term propaganda has acquired a strongly negative connotation by association with its most manipulative and jingoistic examples, propaganda in its original sense was neutral and could refer to uses that were generally positive, such as public health recommendations, signs encouraging citizens to participate in a census or election, or messages encouraging persons to report crimes to law enforcement. Citation needed. So, what's interesting is the last one kind of hits actually a little closer to home, because every time you go to a hospital or a doctor's office, don't you see those weird little signs that say, make sure you wash your hands, or, here, steps to take in the event of, having an illness, make sure you do this, 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 this. That's all propaganda. It's kind of neutral, although I've also been in doctors' offices where it was anything but neutral. That is to say that the messages being promoted were, I'd look at them going like, what are they trying to say to me? Why are they painting a smiley face on everything? So, here's, we'll start with a little bit of Jacques Ellul's definition, and then we'll come back to it a little later. This is what he says. Here's one quote. In the midst of increasing mechanization and technological organization, propaganda is simply the means used to prevent these things from being felt as too oppressive and to persuade man to submit with good grace. Or again, I want to emphasize that the study of propaganda must be conducted within the context of a technological society. Propaganda is called upon to solve the problems created by technology, to play on maladjustments, and to integrate the individual into a technological world. So what he does is he relates it all back to technology. And what he's really trying to say is that the size of things and the fact that we have to use mass communication in order to put a message into this large system, you're already using the principles of propaganda. We'll continue. He points this out, that people tend to recognize that propaganda has a psychological effect. So they turn to psychologists for answers and assurance. They want to know that they're psychologically strong enough to be invulnerable to propaganda. However, Ellul says if you want to understand propaganda, don't talk to the psychologists. They don't know anything about it. Talk to the propagandists. They know how to work. For instance, advertisers are by and large propagandists. There is a reason why they spend millions and millions and millions and billions of dollars to make a commercial that will end up with just a little Coke logo and nothing else that even shows the product, and why they know that works upon you. But it's also human relations, public relations, various media-related services that every government agency, every government personage has to have someone who runs defense for them. And all of this is part of the propaganda world. But let's continue. There are areas of propaganda. I am condensing lots and lots of material, but I want to give you a real definition of propaganda here so that you understand, when I come to talking about social media, what I'm talking about. There's much more in the book. Trust me, I'm just throwing a stone across the water here. There's a lot more in this book. It's a deep, dark, thick book, and when you first wade in, it takes you a while. Areas of propaganda. So we have psychological action, psychological warfare, education, re-education, which we in some places might be called brainwashing, public and human relations. Now that's one way of looking at it. So there are different ways in which, for instance, our educational system, oh boy, lots of propaganda going on there. Someone showed me a book of history that they were using in the Haynes High School. And I said, oh great, I like history, let's see your book. And I looked at it, and it was like, okay, here's Renaissance Italy, medieval Japan, the 20th century, say the 60s, and it was just all over the place. There was no beginning or end. Well, that is a very clear statement that we want to be diverse. We want to be, everything is equal. But it's a very clear statement of what the construction of the universe is like. And that is, it's random. So that the person picking up the book learns not to put pieces together. I mean, I've learned over the years that because I do have the kind of mentality that puts a thing together here and a thing together here and sees them as, oh, this came from this and this came from this. When I start talking to someone who's right now, say, below the age of 30, I notice they don't have quite this sense of putting things together. Because the world that they have been taught through the propaganda that they are surrounded by is that the world isn't like that. That there isn't, what came before isn't as important as what is now. So, kind of gives me an advantage when I'm talking, unfortunately, and I wish I didn't. I wish people would say, no, but this didn't happen first. I wish they could argue like that. But again, we've kind of removed certain aspects of conversation. Propaganda, first and foremost, involves technique. And technique is, for Jacques Ellul, a very important word. It relates to the technological society. So it means not just machines, mechanization, but it also involves techniques for, systems for doing things. So having a schedule is a technique. People used to not have schedules that were very, you had to have a clock to have a schedule. So that's a technique. But propaganda always involves techniques. We are now currently surrounded by technology. Filmmaker Godfrey Reggio, who pays a very clear debt to Jacques Ellul, says that he made the films Koyaanisqatsi and the others that he made in order to show that our life now is not affected by technology, but that we are living in the host of technology. So that, think about your relationships with people. Is there someone here who doesn't have relationships through the internet or through texting and things like that? All those are relationships and techniques. And so things are happening while we are using these techniques and to our relationships. Jacques Ellul makes a point that essentially there are three environments in which the human being has been in. The first, evidently, was nature. So the problem with nature is, well, of course, we've got the sun to provide us warmth, we've got rain to provide us water, we've got the ground, we've got the trees, we've got animals. All this is part of nature. However, nature also has things like hurricanes and floods and locusts and droughts and other things. So that in order to escape the perils of nature, we then have society. That's the next environment, the social world. So we created cities, and we created agriculture in order to put things together. But now the problem here is, well, yeah, we get a lot. We can band together against the animal world, which used to prey upon us. We could band together against, if you have a big, strong building, you're safe from the environment. You can band together. But the social world ended up having problems even worse than the natural world. And some of those were war, disease, which was then spread through whole towns rather than just isolated villages. Think of all the strange things done in the name of love. That's all part of the social world. Or economics, all the strange things that go in the name of economics, all part of the social realm. And so in order to get away from the perils of that environment, we then turn to technology, which is now the environment we live in. And I live in Alaska. I can do something that, well, you can kind of do it around here. You can walk off in a few, after a few paces, and you can be in the woods. Although, you're in Switzerland, you're not really that isolated. Where I live, I can actually walk off 100 yards, 100 meters, and I will be thinking about bears and stop thinking about you real quickly. Because that's the world I live in. It's the real, nature is still there, and it's not exactly a zoo. It's not a quarantined place. But it's kind of like we're on the edge of it. For most of us, and even in Alaska, technology is, Alaskans have cell phones. Alaskans have television. People often talk to me like I'm living in the middle of some world that's just like, yeah, I'm living in a hut. I go outside, I chop my wood every day, and there are bears at my door. It's not like that, really. It's really much more that, we go to the supermarket, we use our cars. All of the stuff is involved with technology. If you want to, you can get cable television. It's too expensive for me. But I get DVDs or whatever. It's all part of technology. So most of our human relationships now happen within the realm of technology. Most of nature happens within the realm of technology. That is to say, we're always trying to contain it. It's just like, there's a storm coming, get ready. Well, who's telling us that? Technology has provided that information. So, essentially, we live in this world where we must use technology. And as a result, we suffer for it because we don't really even know yet. The technological world is much too new for us to really understand, like we do nature and the social world, the defects. Some of them must certainly be alienation and isolation. People, it's like, yeah, I'm in touch with someone. No, you're not. You're on a little cell phone. I hate to break the news to you. You could be communicating with someone across the world, but you're not. You're isolated from them. Technology isolates you. Paul Virilio, the French theorist, said, every bit of optical equipment we get for seeing the world is one more bit of seeing that we can no longer do ourselves, because we put something in between us and it. So we need to ask questions. And this is where propaganda comes in. Propaganda kind of makes the means the end. Jacques Ellul says, the aim of modern propaganda is no longer to modify ideas, but to provoke action. Propaganda does not aim to elevate man, but to make him serve. To be successful, propaganda must always be based on facts. So this is one of the big counter stories to the idea that propaganda is always lies. But guess who said that first, most clearly? It was Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propagandist. He said everything we say must be based on fact, which is pretty amazing. Kind of makes you think. Okay, mass media, by virtue of its size alone, as I pointed out, is already propaganda. Though mistakes do occur. That is to say, there are cracks that we, who are human beings, can exploit within the system. Occasionally a movie gets through and you go like, wow, how did they get that made in Hollywood? It's like more and more music is more technological, but occasionally music will come through just through some zone. You go like, or maybe some friend made a CD where they just sat down and played, and you go, wow, that's really nice. Mistakes can occur. But essentially, the problem is that technology leaves us alone in the mass. And Ellul says the most favorable moment to seize a man and influence him is when he is alone in the mass. It is at this point that propaganda can be the most effective. Now, traditionally, television, cinema, newspapers are all systems that leave you alone in a mass. Television, I'm watching a show. It used to be, I'm watching a show at 7:30 on Sunday night, and everybody else in America is watching the same show roughly at the same time. But I was alone within a mass of people. Cinema, I'm sitting alone in this group, but lots of other people are watching it, but I don't necessarily know them. Maybe I came with friends, but I'm kind of alone in the mass of people all watching this film. Newspaper is the same. I open it up, and I'm alone among a mass of people reading a newspaper. And you can see, if you just continue on with this a bit, nothing leaves you more alone within the mass than social media. It's like perfect. And it also then is the perfect means for propaganda. Propaganda must adapt the individual to the technological society. That is, say, I must be made to fit within, which is why we all go through this thing when a new technology starts, and at first you go like, that's not going to happen to me. I'm not going to be the first one to do X. And then after a while you start noticing a few like daredevils who are the first ones to wear, I don't know, Google Glass or something. And then after a while, if it catches on, everyone starts doing it. And then after a while, if you're not doing it, like I'm usually the one left last, then you start saying, I wonder why I'm not doing this. So, for instance, I've never made the leap, hardly even to cell phones. I use them a little bit, but I've never gone to the smartphone. So I watch how people use them. And I'm looking over their shoulders. I know how to use technology. It's not a question. I mean, I can edit films on Final Cut Pro. Smartphones aren't exactly going to be a leap in the dark for me. But I notice the behavior that goes with it, and I go like, whew, I don't really want to be near that behavior. So let me think about it some more before I have to. One day someone's going to put a gun at my head and say, you must or else. I mean, it's almost starting to happen now where, someone will say, you can't do this unless we access your cell phone. To which I'm going like, well, I guess I'm not doing it. Oh, also, the technological milieu is rarely touched by the individual. That is, the idea that you can make a difference to this technological stream, it's pretty much an illusion. And that would be one of Ellul's big points, is that the individual is not going to go in there and like change the system. Or the people aren't going to go in there and like take their political party and we're going to be different. It doesn't work like that, especially not in a mass society where the only means to really communicate is through propaganda. Propaganda is a totality. It is all surrounding. There has been a loss of traditional societies, and that vacuum has been filled by various forms of propaganda media. So Ellul makes this point. It's a lengthy quote, but let me get it out here. Propaganda tries to surround man by all possible routes in the realm of feelings as well as ideas, by playing on his will or on his needs, through his conscious and unconscious, assailing him in both his private and his public life. It furnishes him a complete system for explaining the world, and it provides immediate incentives to action. We are here in the presence of an organized myth that tries to take hold of the entire person. Through the myth it creates, propaganda imposes a complete range of intuitive knowledge susceptible of only one interpretation, unique and one-sided, and precluding any divergence. This myth becomes so powerful that it invades every area of consciousness, leaving no faculty or motivation intact. It stimulates in the individual a feeling of exclusiveness and produces a biased attitude. Essentially, it is a total system that works over the individual within the mass. Marshall McLuhan, the theorist, used to say that the media work us over all the time. Kind of like, he also used to use the phrase, the medium is the massage. It works you over. It is a total system that works over the individual within the mass in order to affect a societal change. And the societal change is always in the direction of adapting us to technology. Ellul goes on, he says, propaganda must be total. The propagandist must utilize all the technical means at his disposal. The press, radio, TV, movie, posters, meetings, door-to-door canvassing. Modern propaganda must utilize all these media. There is no propaganda as long as one makes use, in sporadic fashion and at random, of a newspaper article here, a poster or radio program there, organizes a few meetings and lectures, writes a few slogans on the wall. That is not propaganda. And that's also why this is not propaganda. Is because what I'm saying here is just like one little person saying something that basically is never going to be heard on television. Because this is more about humanity. Nobody wants to put this kind of message on television. This is like anti-television in the most extreme sense. To tell you to think about what you're watching and what it's doing to you. Nah, nobody wants that. So that you can pretty much be sure I'm not giving you propaganda, because it's not. There's nothing behind me. Jacques Ellul, one book. So what? And some other books, but still, it's and I don't think this is ever going to be a majority opinion. In other words, I don't think we'll ever form the anti-propaganda bloc. Do you understand? It's like having a bumper sticker that says, don't use bumper stickers. I don't think it's going to happen. But propaganda must also be continuous. We have to live in it, which leads us to different systems of propaganda. Everyone here, probably in some way or another, is probably connected to some system or systems of propaganda. Christians, I must say, have very good systems of propaganda these days. So you can live in a world of Christian music, Christian movies, Christian television, Christian this, Christian that. And if you live in that world, you are living in a propaganda world. But it's the same with feminism, it's the same with anarchism, it's the same with communism, it's the same with, Donald Trump is not heading towards doing such a good job at trying to be the president of the United States because he isn't appealing to someone within a certain propaganda block. He is nailing that block. He is nailing the outrage and the rage of people who simply are sick of all the other stuff that people are saying. So it's just a very specific kind of Yahooism, you might say, of just certain kind of it's the kind of people who write the really nasty stuff below essays and blogs and things that they disagree with. It's flame, but we'll come to that in a moment. But we all live within different systems. The question is, you have to ask yourself, what am I connected to? And then start to pry yourself a bit away from it so you get the truth of what you believe, as opposed to the cliches of what you believe. To be successful, propaganda must attach itself to the fundamental currents of society, and this is very important. Ellul says it cannot violate... No, this is not Ellul. Or is it? No, it's not. It cannot violate certain presuppositions within the technological society. It is a totality hosted by the mythologies of the day. Technology and mass communication are inescapable. So he points out, and I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but it's worth just mentioning. He says there are four great sociological presuppositions in the modern world. Within the modern, we'll call it Western world or whatever, but the world that is spreading, because it's now much further than just the West. But these four presuppositions are that an individual's aim in life is happiness, that man is naturally good, that history develops in endless progress, and that ultimately everything is matter. He says those are the four great sociological presuppositions. And a propagandist is not going to go too far unless they stick with that, even if they use other language in a spiritual sort of way to communicate that. And then he says there are collective myths at work as well. So there's the myth of work, the myth of happiness, the myth of the nation, the myth of youth, and one that's a little more tarnished now, and yet I still believe it's there, the myth of the hero. And he says there are many kinds of propaganda: political versus sociological, rational versus irrational, agitation versus integration, and vertical versus horizontal. And I'm going to discuss vertical versus horizontal. In fact, I'm not going to really discuss vertical much at all, but I will mention what it is in a moment. But Ellul, giving you kind of a summary of many of the aspects of his book on propaganda, ends up by saying this. Having analyzed these traits, we can now advance a definition of propaganda. Not an exhaustive definition, unique and exclusive of all others, but at least a partial one. Propaganda is a set of methods employed by an organization or group that wants to bring about the active or passive participation in its actions of a mass of individuals, psychologically unified through psychological manipulations and incorporated in an organization. It's a set of methods or techniques employed by an organization, organized group. And an organized group here doesn't have to mean like a corporation or a society of a certain kind. I think it can be interpreted a little bit looser than that. That wants to bring about the active or, and this is very important, passive participation in its actions of a mass of individuals, psychologically unified through psychological manipulations and incorporated in an organization, keeping in mind that its goal is to adjust us to the technological realities of the day. You cannot go against those if you want to make propaganda. Interestingly enough, if you read Jacques Ellul's book, he makes the case so well that if I were a propagandist, I would use that book to make propaganda. That's how well he dissects it. I mean, and he seems neutral at times, but he's not. He's really not at all. And you'll see this eventually. I'm going to put Ellul aside for a while here, but let's discuss just the concepts of vertical and horizontal propaganda. Vertical is top-down. It's rarely bottom-up. I can't think of many illustrations of that, but it's top-down. It's a lot like war propaganda, in that war propaganda is not going to be coming from the people, it's going to be coming from, it's those posters that say, I want you. It's going to be coming from the hierarchical sources that need some motivation. It's the same in corporations, it's the same in most organizations or most belief structures. It's going to be coming from the people at the top who want the people at the bottom to do something. And there's also kind of an idea here. I think most people who think about propaganda are always thinking about fighting the forces above. So Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party both were filled with, what they are doing to us from above and how we're going to fight them back. And so the lie is here that all propaganda comes from above. However, besides Big Brother, there's also the little brothers and sisters. And that's us. And we tend to get involved with the next phase, which is horizontal propaganda. All societies have had some form of top-down propaganda, vertical propaganda. Rome, think of the coins, the legions themselves were a great form of propaganda. But the coins, every coin had a little picture of Caesar on it. That tells you something about who's in charge of the society. Just the declaration of Caesar as a god. What an amazingly powerful piece of propaganda that was. And in fact, the Christians ran afoul of that one because they wouldn't go along with it. And by not going along with it, they upset the whole apple cart. Fighting propaganda is a tough thing to do. And the first century Christians managed to find a way to rankle the very tolerant Romans. Or think of the Middle Ages, medieval, let's say Renaissance Catholicism. There were indulgences. There was a form of not only collecting money, but of propaganda to make the new St. Peter's Cathedral. There was, of course, the Inquisition. That's a pretty serious form of propaganda. If you know you don't speak heretically, unless you want to face the wheel or the rack, you don't speak. Unless you're like some crazy guys in Northern Europe who, were decided, okay, set me on fire, But still, the Inquisition, wow. But also, on the plus side, they also had a lot of art. Most of the Baroque Catholic art had a point of giving people a newer emotional response to Christianity. They felt that during the Renaissance it had become a little cold, so they needed a newer emotional form of Christianity. Of course, then there's the obvious examples of Nazi Germany, Soviet-era communism. But of course, there's also 50s-era America, where you had, the big poster showing a family driving saying the American way of life. Or you had atomic bomb drills in school. Or you had the McCarthy hearings, which created a lot of fear on the fear side of the propaganda. Or you had even television shows which didn't have any specific, top-down. These weren't being created by people being directed to make these, but shows like Leave It to Beaver or Father Knows Best showed a very bland kind of middle America. This is what we want to be. It's the American way of life. So that was like a 50s form. So what is horizontal propaganda? It's what we do to each other. And this is much harder for us to see. Because we all tend to think, them up there, they're the evil ones. They're the ones who are pressuring us and making us do things. But we, well, except for that person I work with I don't like, we're pretty, we wouldn't do anything to each other. Essentially, horizontal propaganda is kind of a variation on the crab mentality. If you get crabs in a bucket, another name for this is officially crabs in a bucket, or the crab mentality. If you get crabs in a bucket, if you put one in there, it'll jump out, try to escape. If you put two, the second one will hold on to it, trying to get out itself, and not allow the first one out, nor get out itself, because it will be held back. And the more crabs you put in a bucket, they'll never get out. Now that is one way often people interpret that as people trying to hold you back and hold you down. But the way I'm interpreting it is like this. Make sure you're thinking the right thing. Make sure you're saying the right thing. Make sure you're not out of the box too much. Make sure your ideas kind of stay with the rest of us. Don't get too individual in your individualism. Schools and education. There's a lot of horizontal propaganda going on here. Now, from the top down, you do have the books being passed down. You do have things being done from the teachers from a certain point of view. Although there's a certain point at which the teachers start to become part of the horizontal propaganda. And that is to say, they become part of the people who hold each other down into these forms of thinking. Here's the next conundrum. You can really see this at the college level when, I look at it and I'm always amazed by how people go to college and change. Sometimes they're changing because of lectures they've heard, but often they're not changing because of lectures they've heard. They're changing because they've been around a whole bunch of people who dress and act a certain way. That's a perfect example of horizontal propaganda. And it's really subtle, because it doesn't happen, for a person to walk in and say, I'm this, and then remain that, when everybody else is that. There's a great movie that came out, Blue Like Jazz. Did anyone see that? There's also the book on the subject where the guy goes to Reed College in Oregon, and basically it's kind of like a beetle in a hamster pit. It's just like they all are like, what are you doing here? And he's like, I want to be a hamster, and in the end he realizes, well, I'm stretching this analogy way too far. He wants to be a beetle. But, in the sense he wants to remain himself. But he has to kind of become like everyone else to be like that. He kind of gives up all of his Christian beliefs and such because it's just not cool. And cool. Another word for cool, horizontal propaganda. Being cool. Well, I've had people come up, oh, Byrne, you're so cool. I go like, don't ever call me cool. I'd rather be hot. But anyway, but in a McLuhan-esque sense. Anyway, C.S. Lewis talks about propaganda in education, and in the book The Abolition of Man, and he's talking about mostly the kind of horizontal propaganda that comes from the teachers, and also from the people who wrote those books, which aren't necessarily being directed from the top, but they're the next stage up. The people who are teaching you are not that far different from you. He says, if they, the people who wrote this one book on education, embark on this course, the difference between the old and the new education will be an important one. The old initiated, the new merely conditions. The old dealt with its pupils as grown birds deal with young birds when they teach them to fly. The new deals with them more as a poultry keeper deals with young birds, making them thus and thus for purposes which the birds know nothing. In a word, the old education was a kind of propagation, men transmitting manhood to men. The new is merely propaganda. And oh, by the way, if the word min in that made you squirm in that sentence, and you didn't automatically translate it into so you understood it in the present terms, if you didn't get the intention of the piece, and I know people I would read that, and they'd hear min, manhood, blah, 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 just like, bing! Well, voila, welcome to propaganda. Because it's those kind of knee-jerk reactions that are almost like dead giveaways to our propagandizedness. So when you go like, bang, and you can't hear what a person says because they've suddenly made a mistake somewhere. And there are many other modes of horizontal propaganda in economics, industry, sports, religion, popular culture, including movies, music, video games, graphic novels. Almost any form of art or communication can become horizontal propaganda. But we're going to focus now on horizontal propaganda through social media. Social media, broadly defined, might mean this. Any means allowing people to connect to each other through the mediation of the computer and the internet. Whether through the official means, like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, etc., or in the older sense of people communicating through discussions about films, music, politics, etc., in the relation to the essay or the blog or the chat room or something like this. That's an earlier form of social media. Social media best perfectly captures Ellul's warning about the mass and the individual. Because really, if I go onto my Facebook page and I see all this stuff, I'm not really there. They're not in my room. They're far away. Anyone in Alaska right now is like, I don't know, 10,000 miles away from me right now. They're not here. Not really. Not at all. And I'm just typing a few sentences at them. So I'm alone. Social media works best at capturing what Ellul says about the mass and the individual. Again, just repeating what he said. The most favorable moment to seize a man and influence him is when he is alone in the mass. It is at this point that propaganda can be the most effective. So, one of the big differences between the slightly older systems and the post-Facebook world is that the earlier systems, and we're talking about on the computer here, the earlier systems allowed for more anonymity. Hence the concepts of like flame, massive arguments online, and trolling. Things like that are developed where in the earlier kind of Wild West days of the internet, you could, and you still can in many circumstances, put up a smoke screen in front of your name so that they don't, you're like, Labrie 17 or something, They don't know who you are. So you can come along and just say whatever you want. In this earlier version of social media, we're often subject to what's called Godwin's Law. Does anyone know what that is? Godwin's Law, it's pretty funny actually. It says that if an online discussion, regardless of topic or scope, goes on long enough, sooner or later someone will compare someone or something to Hitler or Nazism. MySpace was kind of a halfway house between the current use of social media and the older use, because MySpace allowed you to create your own profile page and decorate it any way you want, but it also allowed you total anonymity. So, for instance, I remember when I was on MySpace for a while, and I wanted to see who was in Romania, because I was actually thinking maybe I'll go there someday or something. And I looked, and I saw Romania was mostly filled with vampires. That's what they all said, you see? And so that was like this weird halfway house. Whereas Facebook isn't going to allow people they really get upset if you don't use your name, your real name, or some variation thereof. In other words, you have to have one identity and stick with it on Facebook. That's the basic rule. I often go on, read some article or something, and then you'll see a reaction to this. And this is the old style response on social media. So this was a reaction to an article about Russia by essayist Timothy Garton Ash, who writes for The Guardian. Now, I think he's a pretty fair guy. I don't agree with him on everything. I'm pretty sure he's not a Christian, but I appreciate his outlook, and I have been appreciating it for a while. So he writes about Russia. Now, what he basically writes is, you could put it in a word, Putin's kind of a problem. Just summarize in a nutshell, and a big problem. what are we going to, what will the West do? So these are some of the reactions that I just culled from directly below. I didn't get them all because there were thousands, but I'm just going to read them. I'm going to leave some of the really bad grammar intact because I think that's part of it. It says, your other Russia, all caps, I'll do that when it's all caps, is created mainly by the West, for the West, and is financially supported by the West. And all you other heroes are not respected in Russia and are backed by a tiny group of pro-Western hating Russia Jewish community. Next. Wow, think much? Next. You are right in terms of the real issue. I'd like to point out that the person who wrote wow, think much is just as much a propagandist here as anybody else. What does that mean? It means you're not a human being. That's what it means. You're right in terms of the real issue. Governments are using population as pawns in their games, usually based on egos and not really on any necessity that of that particular government. Unfortunately, every Westerner that ever comes to power immediately assumes Russia as a target of aggressive policy. And it is like a tradition mixed with a complex of unwarranted superiority. It is inconceivable to civilized mindset that there is one country in the world that manages to resist civilization every time the civilizers came. The only exception that I know is Abraham Lincoln, who detested Russia while being representative in Senate and learned to appreciate it when he became president. His correspondence with Russian emperor is quite a fascinating read. No true. This is the next one. No true. Though Reagan used anti-communism as a domestic political device, ultimately he did not view Gorbachev the way you describe, and Yeltsin was viewed very positively for perhaps longer than he should have been. The difference is how Russian leaders treat their people. Americans and most countries in the democratic West have an inherent bias against authoritarian regimes. Next. How about a story about hawkish, arrogant empires become as their power slips and is challenged on the periphery? Next. You could apply much of this story to the USA and its hold over its empire with 700 bases to show muscle when needed. Next. The author is blinkered and has spent too long living in Poland in the pocket of Washington. Next. I've commented previously on this article. The article simply reflects the one-sided Western propaganda that the Ukrainian crisis is all due to Putin's aggression. Nothing can be further from the truth, as this article explained why the Ukrainian crisis is the West's fault. There's a link there to another article that explains why the Ukrainian crisis is the West's fault. Next, the reality is that the Ukraine has always been a geopolitical target, a pivot state, as Brzezinski argues in the Grand Chessboard. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was an understanding NATO would not expand eastward following the reunification of East and West Germany, but this did not happen. Instead, NATO has steadily expanded eastwards with the eventual aim of incorporating Ukraine into the Western sphere of influence, something that is unacceptable to Russia. Putin feared that the following of the Western-inspired coup, Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula would become a NATO naval base and thus exert influence over the Black Sea. So it's little wonder he annexed this region and wishes to help destabilize the neo-fascist Kiev government waged war on the Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine. Oh, that was also done by someone called The Truth, spelled Treuth, 2015. Actually, this is what The Truth 2015 wrote. There is another Russia beyond Putin. He's quoting someone else. There is not, and it will not appear until the West has collapsed. Now, the reason I read you that is because it's all from the perspective of something most of us don't care about. That is to say, most of us don't spend a lot of time thinking about Russia. Therefore, you can really see the reactions to the Russian situation. And what happens is, and a lot of those are from Russians. That is to say, a lot of those, they will find something like that and just like rip it apart. Because, of course, they're not propagandized. But let me read you a little bit of another one here. This one was, okay, there was a video about a month or so ago showing 3 girls kind of dressed like cheerleaders singing a song in praise of Donald Trump. Oh, so someone's seen it. Anyone else seen it? Okay, a couple people have been mutated by this thing. So, this is the reactions to it. Now, it was, I can't remember, was one classic American song with the kind of Trump lyrics. So I'm going to I get names on this one, so I'm going to read the names, and I just want you to hear. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show you what, and I know when MySpace first came out, they had a section for different kinds of discussions. So I went over to the religious discussions, and then I went over to see what it was like. It was just a nightmare battlefield of people slagging each other. And I remember it started off with something like, is there a God or something? Someone wrote that. And then just like went on and on and on and on and on. Just like, there is no God. This is just propaganda, blah, 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 blah. And then some poor girl down in the middle goes, like, well, praise Jesus, he is Lord. And I was like, what are you doing writing here? You're in the wrong spot. These people, and of course, 5 seconds later, people have descended on this like a herd of locusts to just absolutely eviscerate this person. And I felt bad because I could just see this person thinking, I'm going to do God a favor and defend him. And this is just not the spot. This is, it's a propagandized situation where nothing is neutral. You're not going to have a real discussion on this kind of forum. This pretty much tells me where America is, and not all of America, but obviously there's people who write on stuff like this, who tend to be the cranky folk. But this will tell you a little bit of something about America 2016. Obama is an idiot and more. Bernie is a socialist. Hillary should be in prison. And then there are 2 American flag emojis. And it says, Trump for president. Andreas Wehrholm, asterisk, social democrat. Andreas Wehrholm again. If you call the other people idiot, at least make sure you manage to spell the sentence correctly. Vlad Cessant, and use correct grammar, idiot. Josh Gibson, I bet you hate poor people and people of color. Doug Fleming to Andreas Wehrholm. Bernie plainly, this is all caps. Bernie plainly and proudly says he's a socialist. He's a socialist running under the Democrat Party, just like Rand Paul plainly and proudly says he's a libertarian running under the Republican Party. Ms. Kira Niche to Andreas. I was thinking the same thing. Lol. Nicholas J. Did anyone else read that in the girl singer's voice to the Over There tune? Thomas Kivovitz. You're trolling, right? 4 question marks. Joshua William Gibson. A social democrat who loves the middle class. I guess that's the description of Joshua William. Would give everyone free education and universal health care. Who believes in democracy based off the Scandinavian government? From the country of Scandinavia, evidently. So, Renee McCartan. Oh, hell no. You want to send us to war again? Jose Daniel Soto. Trump is a turd. Johnny Kate Lee. It must be Johnny Kate, because it's spelled without an H. Anyway, it's a girl, I'm assuming. Johnny Kate Lee, although maybe I shouldn't. Why does socialism have such a bad connotation? This isn't the Cold War. Wake up and realize it's 2016 and do some research into what socialism entails, Doug Fleming. Simon Vaca. As a Brit, like most of us, I find it mind-boggling that socialism is such a dirty word in the USA. Rachel Nader. Ann asterisk idiot. Haley Grace DePriest to Johnny Kate Lee. Agreed. Nicole Manzanek. Asterisk an idiot. Maybe there's some emoji there I'm not getting. And it goes on and on and on until finally, yes indeed, okay, how come all the girls are white? That's racist, lol. I think it was corny, but it's a song about America performed by American kids. What's wrong with that? And it goes on and on and on. I could go on. It's funny, but it's not worth really spending time on. But that's like standard. I mean, just go look at like I don't know. Feedback for the year, Brokeback Mountain didn't win the Oscars. Go look at Crash. That's a nightmare of just people like stabbing and bleeding over each other over all sorts of issues. It goes on and on. But that's the dark side of social media. Facebook is not like that. Post-Facebook, you are now in touch with people you supposedly know. And this changes everything. So that rather than being the internet being a wide open free-for-all of ideas behind faceless people, instead it has become a zone where one must tread very, very carefully. And the global change that has come through social media is astounding. The world is not the same place it was before the year 2000. It's not the same place it was before the year 2005. And it's not the same place it was before the year 2010. That's how deeply these things have affected us. And it's because of social media. That is to say, what's happened is we've all gotten linked in to looking at things a certain way. A few good aspects of social media. I've connected with a great many friends that I had lost touch with. People from my time growing up in California, years and years ago, former Labrie students, artists and musicians and others from my time in New York City. What's really interesting is that probably the best thing is that I can introduce myself to friends in countries like the Czech Republic and Georgia, people I would have had an extremely difficult time meeting in any other form. And also I can keep up with what my friends are up to, what projects they're involved with, and occasionally I can see what kind of problems they are having. Now that's all the good side of social media, that you can stay in touch with people that before social media, even during the era of the earlier part of the virtual age, essentially it was very hard, through email to really connect and find all these people. But suddenly, boom, 300 friends. But then the problems arise. Everything is not just human sharing. And there are issues I'm not going to spend too much time on here, including the fact that we are constantly being tracked and monitored through these things. I'll give you an example. I was recently looking, what was I looking at? It was like, I was looking for some, piece of equipment for my, working on this documentary, a piece of video. I go to Facebook, check my homepage, and there, looking at me on Facebook, which has nothing to do with the places I was looking, is like the same thing I was just looking at. Now, how do they know this? Well, there's no one who knows this. These are algorithms and web bots or whatever that go through these things and pick out your information. And these things are happening all the time. But that's not the kind of issue I'm really worried about here. Relates to privacy and security and things like that. What's interesting to me is that first there are minor annoyances on something like Facebook. I'm going to deal mostly with Facebook because I don't have a Twitter account and I've really never seen the point. I don't want people to follow me in that way. And I can understand why some people do. It particularly is helpful if a person has some sort of career that other people are following. And the truth is, it's not just Facebook. All the various Pinterest and Instagrams, and there's all this is part of social media in one form or another, all these different little systems. Minor annoyances. Oversharing. People who share much too much about themselves. So-and-so is now in a relationship with, and you get to see their photos of them everywhere. I really, fine, you're in Hawaii again and again. I don't particularly care. I hate to point this out, but baby and toddler photos, lots too much. There should be an app that just sends you, or at least something that just sends those photos straight to the people who want to see them, which is like the parents and of the people and the brothers and sisters and such. And just maybe once in a while we get one in the big world. Because if you've seen like 30 baby pictures of one baby in their first year, you know how many baby pictures I have of myself up until, childhood pictures I have, including baby pictures, up until about the age of, say, 7 or 8? I have about 6. And that's really great. I have friends who probably have, up until the age of 10, maybe 5,000, 6,000 images of themselves that their overactive parents have taken, and they've shared a certain amount of those online. Not all of that, but, they've put quite a few. But these are minor annoyances, really. What I ate for breakfast photos. Yeah, okay, it's a nice breakfast, but really? Pithy observations. Only a couple of my friends are very good at this on Facebook. If I have, we'll say 300 friends for the sake of, I don't know what the exact number is. If I have 300 Facebook friends, I've got 2 or 3 that make pithy observations that are worth hearing. And all the rest that post all these little funny, humorous little cartoons and slogans and stuff. I mean, if you get too bad, I just unfollow you. I leave you as a friend, but I'm just I'm tired of seeing this stuff. I want human communication. I'd like to see an update on who you are, but I don't really care about all your little things you think are funny and causes you happen to be supporting this week and such. Because it's not human communication. It's just stuff being passed around. It's kind of comes to the edge of where things start getting strange. Interestingly, the way people have been sharing their photos has changed over time. I remember when Facebook was younger, people would often put a whole block of their photos from vacation online. You'd notice there's an album of this and an album of this and an album of this. Now, people will talk about, if you go back into someone's albums and look at their old photos, it's kind of like you're stalking them. Which is weird how that changed. So now people tend to be a little more judicious about the photos. I had one friend that put 100 and some odd photos on it once of all the stuff he'd found on the internet. It's just really? I don't have time for that. But now people tend to be more, just keep putting stuff up. I was really happy. I've been doing these posts on my website called Gravity from Above, where I talk about the different stages along my documentary making for puppetry. And I saw today that someone had shared a post. And I thought, oh, nice. I don't know this person. So I went and looked at the guy's page. Well, it had disappeared. I mean, he had only done it within 20 minutes. It had already disappeared from his page. Why? He had shared 20 or 30 other things. So it didn't matter that he shared my post, because it had already, once it gets down below the bottom of the page, nobody looks anymore. And that's also an interesting thing in terms of photos and such, so that the photos cease from being interesting once once you've gotten the week's comments or such on them. They cease to have the same kind of interest. But anyway, the major annoyances. Suddenly a friend starts spreading their new mission in life. And I'm about to read some of the new missions in lives that my friends have gone on. And I suddenly start seeing little posters, memes, whatever that is, all these little, things that people put, look at this website, sign this petition, all this sort of stuff. And many of these people, I have to just, once you go off this deep end, you can be sure I will not be looking at your page, and except when you occasionally comment on something of mine. Because it's kind of I'm just afraid of those pages. I open them up, and everything is their cause. They cease to have an identity. They even change their program. There was one that Christians had that was an anti-abortion thing. It was supposed to be to counter the rainbow flag and such. And then, all these are propaganda tools, in a sense, to make a point to say, I'm with this cause. Here's just a list of all the kinds of things that have taken over people's pages with all the stuff they're sharing. So, gun rights, PETA, pro-life, feminism, gay marriage, right and left causes, libertarian, green, anarchist politics, environmentalism, pro and anti-creationism, yoga, New Age mysticism, Christian evangelism, atheism, practically anything. And my point is not to say anything about those things, except simply that this is not a discussion. This is propaganda. Someone has just suddenly joined a group, suddenly has an outlook, suddenly they got, I have a friend who, she was fine, suddenly everything's PETA. And I'm going, why? You're a good person, you're an artist. Why did you suddenly just become this thing? Because it's a thing, it's an organization, it's a group. Why did you just suddenly become their mouthpiece? What happened to human conversation with you? How come I don't know so much about what you're up to anymore? And I have to wade through acres of, do this for them, help this. So that we have the problem of spreading propaganda. But it gets even a bit more insidious. Consider this. Facebook is particularly grievous at this. the like button. Now, the like button is bizarre. It exists to shut down disagreement. There is no other point for a like button. It's to shut down disagreement. It's not a dislike button. It's not a what's going on here button. It's not a I question this button. It's not a button. There's only one button. It's this mild form of and minimum form of affirmation, like. Creating spectacles like someone liking someone's reporting of the death of their loved one. Now, even Mark Zuckerberg realized that's a problem. He was trying to come up with an empathy button, but hasn't figured it out, because any empathy button can be used cynically. Think about it. You find a way to use that one in a way it wasn't intended to. Also, liking what someone's describing something nightmarish and people are liking it. Or so-and-so just broke up with so-and-so. Whoa, like. We're so glad you finally broke up. What's wrong with this picture? Every possible word that's ever been suggested as another button has been shot down, and the rather tepid like remains. And this is fraught, all those other words are fraught with explosion because they bring in the specter of that other side of the internet. They bring in the specter of the locust coming in to eat you. And it also kind of forces one into a positive thinking mask. And I call it a mask because there is the other side. There is all the flame and the trolls and all the opposite side. And it is a mask because people, you may say, I want to feel good about things. But in fact, most of us live a real life where things aren't always good. You don't feel positive about everything. And wouldn't it be great if you could talk to people who wouldn't just dismiss you as like, you're just not positive enough. But that like button forces you kind of to do that. And it also, I see all sorts of things that I go like, oh, why are they starting to do this now? Whatever it is. And I don't want to hit like. I want to hear, and I look and I'm just like, there's no way to communicate with this person. Why? They're behind a wall now. And the wall forces a kind of a behavior. Signs of us being propagandized. And like I say, I have put this up against myself many times. If you are alive in the 21st century, unless you've been living off the grid completely, you have certainly been propagandized. So the real question is, how propagandized are you? Well, here's a real problem. Thinking all of your thoughts originate with you and the media has no real effect on you, resulting in, for instance, you go to college, you end up somewhere else, you're cut off from your family, you're cut off from, say, the traditions you grew up with in a church or in a community. That's a pretty sure sign, because what else is filling that void of the way people in your family and community grew up? What's filling that void now? Well, it's got to be propaganda and in various forms, in all sorts of forms. The knee-jerk reaction. When you hear certain words or thoughts from another camp and you just go, I hate that. And I certainly had that myself. Certain words. And I have to remember, the person using this word is a human being, especially on the internet. They are still a human being. They are using this word because other people use this word. Do they know the ramifications of this word? Maybe, maybe not. But the point is, they're a human being. I have to remember that. Using words that are loaded with freight. Here are a few words loaded with freight. Support. What's wrong with this word? Once you use the word support, you can no longer ask questions. So whether it's supporting the troops or supporting your gay friends, there are no moral disagreements you can have after that point. You must always be nice and encouraging, and we're all friends together. You support them. So not using the word support means there's one, I even didn't write this down, but I meant to. Haters. That's really weird. Nowadays, if someone just expresses any form of kind of dislike, they're suddenly a hater. And people know, well, it doesn't mean you really hate it, but it's still, that's kind of an intense word to use for just mild disagreements. Like, you didn't really like the new Star Wars movies. Well, the Star Wars haters, you see, but then the word hatred itself gets serious freight attached to it when used by certain people. Oh, here's some other words. Gender, That's like got a truckload of freight on it. Diversity, likewise. Freedom, go to the right wing on this one. I mean, everybody wants to claim freedom. On the left, it's kind of like personal freedom. On the right, it's like freedom to own a gun. Whatever it is, it's got a truckload of freight on it. And when people start talking about freedom, I start like backing up a little and just listening because I don't know what's going to come out of their mouth next. But all of these things, I mean, I don't really want to get into what these words mean and such, but these and many other words, I could go on and on. We could have done this whole thing on just the words with a lot of freight these days. Overloaded words. You start being forced to use new terminology or else feel ashamed. Some usages do require thinking. I think stewardesses was kind of a clunky notion, so flight attendant, it's clunky too, but it works. It works a little better. But, without going into all the obvious stuff, some things are simply there by the weight of propaganda. And words start to change their connotation. So, for instance, people didn't want to be anti-abortion or pro-abortion, so they became pro-life and pro-choice because those just sound better. I often say, what's the difference between a real discussion and a propaganda discussion? Well, let's say take an issue that's not a big issue, that one I make up in my own mind, that's having pets or not. There's no big propaganda about this, although maybe PETA has some stuff, but I'm going to assume it's my own territory right now. So having pets or not. Well, one side of it would be people who say, pets are loving animals, that we really should take care of them, they really are help us. What about guide dogs for the blind, old folks with cats, isn't this wonderful? And the other side is saying, think of all the money wasted on dog and cat food. Think of the people that could be feeding. Think of old folks buying cat food in the stores because they need something to eat and it's the cheapest thing they can find with protein. Now what would happen is these two camps would eventually, who'd want to be pro-pet, anti-pet? That just sounds bad. So the anti-pet people would have to change their name first. So they'd end up becoming something like pro-human. And the other side would go like, well, we're not just like pro-animal. That just sounds pro-pet. We're like, pro-comfort. Or, something like, pro-relationship. Ooh, that sounds really good. And eventually, though, it would go from being individual arguments to huge propaganda blocks fighting against each other. Where on one side they'd be making videos showing, the most horrific abuses of pets and showing people eating dogs in China and just horrible. And on the other side, they would and they would be like saying, how can we do this to pets? And then they'd show lots of like cuddly pictures of people so happy with pets. And on the other side, they'd be showing people starving and saying, how can we do this to humanity? Pets are just a drain on humanity. We need to find a better solution. And eventually, while such an issue is not on your agendas right now, most likely, I doubt many of you have had this discussion in the last week, it would eventually become probably pro-pet would be life wing, and anti-pet might be left wing. I don't know, but eventually they would find a right and a left wing. And you would be, your whole, really, are you in favor of humanity? Or are you in favor of relationships? Cross-species relationships. So propaganda does that. It takes words and starts to boil them down. So, I remember the day NPR switched from talking about gay marriage to marriage equality. So that meant they'd taken off the table the fact that we could discuss what was actually happening and saying, you can't discuss it now. It is now this issue, not that issue. It doesn't matter what you think about it. What matters is that the words end up becoming changed in order to mesh with people's thoughts. What feels more comfortable. Like I said, pro-choice, pro-life are really great examples of what had to happen to make those propaganda blocks work. What time is it? I'm almost done. 2:35. 2:30. Sounds like I'm getting there. So, finally, you find yourself being your own thought police. Really censoring yourself. Oh, I got to watch saying that. Oh, don't imitate somebody. Don't do the wrong thing. Watch out. Who are these people? Or you find yourself not even believing that people hold the other point of view. because you so surround yourself with the people who hold viewpoints like yours. That's the nice thing about being at L'Abri, is you're often given a chance to raise questions about what you believe. You find yourself overly sensitive to words and ideas you disagree with. The effect of this kind of thinking in America has been chilling, and I think bordering on totalitarian in some cases. That is to say, there's a clamping down in these different groupings of people. They will no longer tolerate people who have different ideas from the other side. And ultimately, it's an us and them mentality. And us is always, we're evolving, or we're right, or we have the truth, and they are barely and scarcely human. The ideas they have barely, scarcely matter at all. So how to live in this world of drowning while we're drowning in propaganda? A few quick things. First, realize the situation. Don't assume that you are above it. Don't assume you're above it through your intelligence or your humble status, that you're below it somehow, that no one wants your opinion. Be willing to listen to others, especially when they are saying things you flat out disagree with. Next, even harder, be willing to listen to friends when you sense their ideas are drifting away from what they previously believed. And this happens. And that's kind of scary, because I thought I knew this person and now they're believing this kind of thing. Don't cut people off because you disagree with them. Have friends you disagree with. Have friends you disagree with. It doesn't mean you have to go out of your way to find an atheist or a Muslim or something. But even among the people you know what you disagree with about them. Know that it's not all. No two people, no two groups, no two whatever have the same thoughts. Don't simply read, listen, watch, absorb endless propaganda from either your side or, in a spirit of fairness, to the other side. Why? Because of what Jacques Ellul said, is when you listen to two sets of propaganda, if you're like watching MSNBC and then you're watching Fox, you're getting hit from two different opposing propaganda blocks. What's going to happen is you're just going to be left woozy. So, what you need to do is to learn how to find authors, filmmakers, artists, musicians who are honest and not propagandistic, no matter what they believe. So, I can find an atheist, author that I say, this person is an honest atheist. They believe this, but they're not a member of the bloc. They're not trying to, they recognize that there's a value to what I believe as well. They just happen to disagree. This person I want to talk to. But I don't want to talk to the militant atheist of the moment who happens to be following the, Hitchens or Dawkins line, and these people have started practically a new religion. I don't want to simply be I don't want to be involved in propaganda discussions. So there's a difference between that. So when you find authors, musicians, movies, whatever, that really seem to, there's somebody home, really working in the same world you live in, then you can really engage. You may not agree, but that's okay. Especially learn how to avoid propaganda made by people, corporations, groups with whom you supposedly agree. That's the most insidious. Because this is like the Christian people who want to make the Christian movie. Well, I understand why they do, but at the same time, most of the Christian movies are really bad. They are propaganda tools, and they need to be seen through. Be forgiving. When a friend or a church or an institute steps over the line, I hate to admit it, but even L'Abri has stepped over the line a couple times. Back in the early 80s, I think the first How Should We Then Live was a pretty good film, and I think the reason it still holds up is because it's kind of clunkily made. It's not efficient. But after that, the next couple of films that were made during that period, I think were a bit over the line. And I look at particularly Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and I see some of, not so much the interviews, but the extras, the music and the graphics and such like that. And I go like, it's just too much. And fortunately, L'Abri backed away from that. The 80s was kind of a troubling time for L'Abri. They backed away from that and became a little bit more what they should be again. And that is, humbler. So, obviously it goes without saying, don't make propaganda. Don't just simply pass stuff on the internet. Don't, just do stuff for a cause. Do stuff that is human, that is unusual, shows creativity, that shows both the collective nature of the body of Christ, which is not and should not be a propaganda block, but it unfortunately is often turned into one, and show also that which is individually reflects your own relationship to God if you're a Christian, and if you're not, just don't make propaganda. Most importantly, learn to have open discussions, even arguments. The myth that the accepting person is the one who simply supports you and doesn't question you and never argues is dangerous, because my friend is the one who will say, Byrne, why are you doing X? It's not the person who just simply hugs me all the time. Not the person who just says, I love you, I love you, I love you. Because some of that real love has to say, I love you, but why are you doing this to yourself? Why are you thinking these things? Why? Being willing to step in to another person's life, it takes some commitment. Step into another person's life and share something and say something about something which might be troubling to you. Watch out for the following: a conversation that says, we just disagree, because that's almost a sure sign that the relationship between two humans is about to end. When people argued more intensely about ideas, beliefs, and morals, they demonstrated more care, actually. People who used to try to change my point of view as a Christian, those people cared for me. The people who say, well, we just disagree, they don't. So give me the person who's tenacious and willing to step into another person's life, even if they muck it up a bit by accident, rather than the person who's just like, well, we believe something different, but I just want you to know I'm behind you. I'm supporting you somehow. And it's just like, no, I just have the guts to say we disagree. Finally, though much more can be said, this can be seen as a last resort. This is probably seen by many here as the first resort, but I've saved it for the end. Is to rely on the compassion of Christ, both for spreading the message and listening to others. And this is not to be confused with the overloaded use of the word tolerance. That is to say, to have compassion on people doesn't mean to simply accept all their ideas. And a word of caution: Christians are sometimes the most propagandized folks around. That is why I haven't spent more time reading Bible verses discussing the Holy Spirit. It's not that the Bible and the Holy Spirit don't come into play, they do deeply. But it's just to the propagandized Christian, they become like a talisman. They become something you repeat. Proof text it's almost like a magic wand. If I say, thy word is a lamp unto thy feet, and you think, okay, I'm just going to get that in my head. And that's not living in the unpropagandized world. That's living in the propagandized world, where these things are just said over and over as repetition. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to read you what Jacques Ellul says near the end of his book on propaganda, where he talks about the church and propaganda. And he says, obviously, church members are caught in the net of propaganda and react pretty much like everyone else. Because Christians are flooded with various propagandas, they absolutely cannot see what they might do that would be effective and at the same time an expression of their Christianity. Therefore, with different motivations and often with scruples, they limit themselves to one or another course presented to them by propaganda. They too take the panorama of various propagandas for living political reality and do not see where they can insert their Christianity in that fictitious panorama. At the same time, because of its psychological effects, propaganda makes the propagation of Christianity increasingly difficult. The psychological structures built by propaganda are not propitious to Christian beliefs. This also applies on the social plane, for propaganda faces the church with the following dilemma. Either not to make propaganda, but then while the churches slowly and carefully win a man to Christianity, the mass media quickly mobilizes the masses, and the churchmen gain the impression of being out of step and on the fringes of history without the power to change a thing, or to make propaganda. This dilemma is surely one of the most cruel with which the churches are faced at present. For it seems that people manipulated by propaganda become increasingly impervious to spiritual realities, less and less suited for the autonomy of a Christian life. I've already stressed the total character of propaganda. Christians often claim they can separate material devices from propaganda techniques, in other words, break the system. For example, they think they can use press and radio without the psychological principles of techniques that these media demand. Or they think they can use these media without having to appeal to conditioned reflexes, myths, and so on. Or that they can use them from time to time with care and discretion. The only answer one can give to these timid souls is that such restraint would lead to a total lack of effectiveness. If a church wants to use propaganda in order to be effective, just as all the others, it must use the entire system with all of its resources. It cannot pick what it likes. For the distinctions would destroy the very effectiveness for which the church would make propaganda in the first place. Propaganda is a total system that one must accept or reject in its entirety. If the church accepts it, two important consequences follow. First of all, Christianity disseminated by such means is not Christianity. We have already seen the effect of propaganda on ideology. In fact, what happens as soon as the church avails itself of propaganda is a reduction of Christianity to the level of all other ideologies and secular religions. Christianity ceases to be an overwhelming power and a spiritual adventure and becomes institutionalized in all its expressions and compromised in all its actions. It serves everybody as an ideology with the greatest of ease and tends to be a hoax. In such times, there are innumerable sweetenings and adaptations which denature Christianity by adjusting it to the milieu. So lastly, there are subtle propagandas that have invaded all levels of society. Certainly the church, and certainly the church. These are new variations on the myths Ellul spoke about. Be aware that notions like positive thinking, the rather vague notions of fun and cuteness, following your dreams, desires, and hearts, not overthinking things, truth is relative, etc., are in our times in Western society all constantly pushing against us to create an unreal world. And on the other side of the fence is that darker, Virginia Nelson uses the phrase sub-zeitgeist, thing below the surface. There's this darker sub-zeitgeist unleashed in anonymous chat rooms and blogs, and it certainly exists below the surface everywhere. And especially as nice propaganda tends to create fear and anger. So finally, we have a great task ahead of us, and we have to be both salt and light. So we'll stop there.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.